There are many wars being fought today. Physical wars between countries, the gender war, a war between me eating healthy for once or eating Chipotle. But there's one war that hasn't been talked about as often up until recently. The generational war. Okay, boomer, millennials eat avocado toast, Gen Alpha is doomed. We've heard it all before. But when Mario's brother decided he was fed up with it, this conversation came back into the mainstream. In this video, I'd like to discuss every generation currently influencing the world as we know it today. The boomers to the betas. What can we learn about older generations that can be used to predict the future of the newer ones? We have more in common than you might think. Okay, boomer. That's the unfortunate profile of this particular generation. Born between 1946 and 1964, this generation was parented by the Builders generation, also called the Silent Generation, who grew up during World War II, and who built a lot of our infrastructure. They also carried us straight to the moon landing in '69. The boomers are called boomers because of the baby boom, when the population exploded after the conclusion of the war. It went like this. Young men came back from the war, missed their wives, and oops, all kids. Post-war America saw an economic boom. With housing, commercialism, everything hit the gas pedal and skyrocketed this generation to success and financial freedom. It's easy to think of this generation as the grumpy old men and women of today, but that wasn't always the case. The stereotypical image of the pot-smoking, sex-loving hippie, that was the boomers. They would have been teenagers in the 70s, meaning they were born late 50s, early 60s. One of the first rebel generations in recent memory. They were on the front lines of politics, holding protests, pushed for feminism, and prioritized equality. Doesn't sound too far off from a certain other generation, but we'll get to that. Today, the boomers are categorized by their high net worth. They own all the homes, they hold all the stocks, and are often referred to as the bank of mom and dad. Yeah, are you a 30-something living at home, feeling like you failed to launch? It's not just you, it's a sign of a generation growing up in a time where, economically, we're worse off than our parents. So don't feel bad if you haven't quite made it yet. Most of us haven't. The boomers were raised by strict parents. Work hard for your money and success will come. So after their little summer of love and protesting the Vietnam War, they eventually became their parents and began to work hard. They prioritized their careers and pioneered the idea of the middle class. Great! We're in one of the greatest periods of growth and expansion in American history. Unfortunately, this would lead to a lot of burnout for this generation in their later years. A lot of grandmas and grandpas are so eager to connect with you because they secretly don't want you to waste your life working, just like they did. It's kind of sweet when you think about it. Even though they grew up in a time where everyone was flourishing, the stress wasn't completely gone. The Cold War taught every student how to survive a nuclear blast by hiding under your desk. There was a lot of uncertainty at the time. You might wake up tomorrow, and the neighboring city was wiped right off the face of the earth. That being said, the threat of nuclear annihilation and the Red Scare did work to create a sense of patriotism. The country was almost unanimously united against common enemies. In the way of education, baby boomers hadn't yet become hooked on the idea that you needed a college degree to survive in the world. Less than a quarter of them actually pursued higher education. In those days, you could work a factory job or another minimum wage position and support an entire family with a house. Of those that did attend universities, the boomer generation was the last generation where more men than women earned college degrees. Psychologically, the boomers have a hard time talking about their mental health. When they were kids, mental health was only discussed when you watched someone get carried away to the mental asylum. Other than that, you were expected to pick yourself up and carry on. This is why, when faced with mental health challenges like burnout, the boomers often have a hard time admitting they need help, because they were taught that it was a sign of weakness. This poor understanding of mental health was only helped by the fact that this generation often had a lot of people to lean on. Extended family was there to financially assist you if you needed it, and you had a wife and kids who would welcome you home every night, generally speaking. There was a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that wasn't great, but overall, the nuclear family model was the glue that held this entire generation together. For better or for worse. If you were to describe their parents' generation as controllers, you could then describe the boomers as directors. Same idea of being the drivers of progress, but with a better understanding of the world as it became more connected. A more nuanced approach at leadership, coming from their time spent as the rebellious hippies that they were. Clearly, there's a lot to say about the boomers. A lot of people feel they reaped the benefits of a prosperous economy, and they tanked it so their kids would be worse off. However, it's important to look at the big picture here. If you want to follow this idea that the real economy dies after 2008, and we've been living on borrowed time ever since, you really should blame Wall Street and big corporations. The boomers were the ones who bought into the system because they were told, this is how this utopia will sustain itself. Work for 40 years, then you get your retirement. After the housing market crashed, a lot of boomers were trying to cash in their hard work, only to find they were sold an empty promise. Born between 1965 and 1979, this generation isn't nearly as well understood in the mainstream. This is my parents' generation. They got on the home ownership bandwagon just like their parents, and they were a tad anti-establishment. They prioritized small businesses and entrepreneurship. These guys were in their 20s and 30s in the 1990s, with the rise of the internet. But they were born just a bit too early to really ride the wave. By the time the internet rolled around, many were already in stable careers, and switching out to invest in the internet wasn't exactly a safe play. You could describe Gen X as born too late to experience the true economic boom, and born too early to capitalize on the internet. One of the sites that I'm getting a lot of this information from describes them as the slacker generation, but I don't think that's entirely fair. They just didn't go through major cultural events like other generations did. There was a stock market slip called Black Monday in 1987. I guess they experienced that. I do have an account of a Gen Xer on hand. Quote, coming after the hippies, we rejected their rejection of the status quo, but we had lost our faith in it too. We were unmotivated, unmoored, and unconcerned. The Cold War chugged along, and we had lost the passion to keep fighting it, but we had no better alternative. Mr. Davenport, he's a prominent figure of the time, urged us to appreciate all that had been given to us. Economic prosperity, world power, freedom. He and his generation had fought for all those goals, and we had received them without lifting a finger. Would we value those goals and keep them alive for future generations? That question has been the curse and the benefit of my generation. We never had to fight for our freedom and wealth, like the Depression and World War II generation. We didn't have to resist an unjust war and push the world forward towards racial and sexual justice, like the baby boomers. We lived out the tail end of the Cold War and the beginning of the 21st century, punctuated by the 9/11 attacks. And all along, we remained on the sidelines, watching prior generations mess things up as we saw it, but never empowered to fix it ourselves. If the boomers were directors, Gen X were the coordinators, the bridge between the old and new generation, which is why they're also often described as the sandwich generation, a generation that often took care of both their parents and their kids. Why do we call them slackers again? I did kind of imply earlier that Gen X was exempt from any major tragedies, but that isn't entirely true. They more so had a slow burn of smaller tragedies, and were the first generation to really develop a distrust of the government. I think this is one of the most interesting generations to study simply because of its lack of character. There's not much you can blame them for, but they weren't exactly changing the narrative either. But I think that's more of a product of technology. Remember, this is the 70s and 80s, which, in my opinion, were defined by commercialism. Disco, Michael Jackson, New Coke. America was swamped in it. Can you really blame this generation for their sedated behavior? They had it pretty good, and that's about it. Ambivalence isn't a crime. Okay, here's a group we're all familiar with. Born between 1980 and 1994, this is the group you would call 90s kids. What were they into? Mostly avocado toast, iced coffee, and DuckTales? The most significant event that shaped the millennials was 9/11. While the generation before them lived in a semi-stable economy and world stage, the September 11th attacks changed everything. The millennials spent their formative years becoming much more aware of global threats and politics. A few years later, the housing market was going down the tubes, and wages flatlined. This generation was in the unique position of being promised great financial freedom, but when they became of age to reap those benefits, they were gone. The internet also had a huge hand in shaping this generation. They remember a time before the internet, but were very quickly intimately familiar with it. The first true pioneers of meme culture. 4chan, Reddit, MySpace. The millennials get a lot of hate for being entitled, just like the boomers. But instead of being entitled for having material wealth, they have massive egos. Allegedly. Apparently. You've probably seen them described as the me generation. They got to ride the wave of the early internet, which gave them a smarter than you kind of vibe. They're also the ones becoming Disney adults, which isn't exactly giving them a great image from the outside looking in. They became Disney adults because they grew up in the 90s, during the Disney Renaissance.
Dude, Pride rock!
How do the millennials parent their own kids? Just like every modern generation before them, they criticize the strictness of their own caretakers, encouraging their kids to be more like themselves. They are now the parents of a generation of gender non-conforming kids, which, let me tell ya, the boomers really have a problem with. The millennials had helicopter parents for the most part, who would impose strict curfews and even gender stereotypes onto them, as an attempt to keep everything stable in their minds. This really pissed them off, and they vowed to be different. I have a lot to say about the millennials, most of which we'll discuss later, when we compare every generation and talk about the drama between them. But I'll say this, no other generation in history has gone through as many significant events and paradigm shifts in technology in early life as the millennials. While Gen X before them didn't have much going on, the millennials had everything going on. They've lived through 9/11, COVID, the rise of AI. If Gen X were coordinators, millennials would be guiding. They had future technology and new ideas, and felt they needed to help others understand it. Hey, we're finally at my generation. I will try to remain as unbiased as possible. I think this site puts it best. Quote, Generation Z kids are the first to be born into a world where they know nothing besides constant connection to one another, albeit through phones, screens, and tablets, unquote. I would say that's pretty accurate. I do remember a time before the iPhone 5, but it's all a fuzzy memory. If you've seen my teen culture video, or my Conquering My Fears video, you have a pretty good idea of this generation. Born between 1995 and 2009, we were really into that 2000s and 2010s culture. We loved SpongeBob, Adventure Time, Regular Show, Gumball, Club Penguin, Pop Tropica, Silly Bands, and Xbox. A lot of commercialism and entertainment. Most of us were born into a post-9/11 world, and even if we were there, we don't remember it. We do, however, sort of remember the 2008 financial crisis. Depending on who you were, this either didn't affect you at all, or it greatly affected you. This generation has learned the hard lesson that the world, and America itself for that matter, just isn't as stable as it used to be. Again, quoting the website here. Quote, economically and socially, they have adapted and become more conservative as a result. But it also means they are more resilient. They focus on education and recognize the importance of it in their foundational years. They know that in a competitive environment, they need to upskill and retrain. and can't just rely on job for life for stability. Lifelong learning is their mindset, unquote. We're a generation that recognizes just how far capitalism has gone to get their marketing straight into your brain. We witnessed large companies and studios pumping out banger films, products, and unbelievable services with new technology. Then, as we grew up, we saw these companies gradually and painfully lose that creative spark that once drove them. And now we have TikTok and, Disney's gone woke, gone broke. I would describe this generation as very anti-capitalist for those reasons. We're one of the first generations to really step back and recognize just how insidious and gross some of these mega corporations can be. Because of this, advertisers have a really hard time cutting through the noise and selling us a product or service. Unless you're one of the lucky ones and became a meme. Then you might have a shot, but if you didn't, good luck. We're a very environmentally conscious generation. We picked that up from the millennials. If millennials were guiding, we would be empowering. It's interesting because I think we actually have a lot in common with Gen X specifically. Gen X was the sandwich generation, in between the successful ones riding the wave of progress and the ones that came after, experiencing new technology, but also lots of tragedies. Gen Z is kind of in that same position. From our perspective, the millennials that got here before us got to ride the wave of the early internet, and those after us are also seeing new technology, but it's not good technology. We're the next sandwich generation. There is one aspect of our generation that I really don't like: cancel culture, and more specifically, cringe culture. Look, I'm over it. I'll be honest. Being the second generation to grow up with the internet, we've labeled ourselves as kind of the main characters. We're the deciders of what's cringe and what's cool. Being so engrossed in the internet from such an early age, we think we control it, and we often forget that we're not the only ones here. I'm not opposed to calling out the shortcomings of my generation, and I think this is one of our biggest ones. Nevertheless, we're often referred to as Zoomers. We have a fairly strange generational identity, and despite growing up in a somewhat tumultuous time for the world, a lot of us are still holding out hope for the future. We remember a time that we can look back on fondly, and we're still fighting for this time period to one day return. For many of us, COVID happened during our transition from high school to college, which are very important years for our development. Because of this, we're one of the loneliest generations in history, with record numbers in depression, suicide rates, and anxiety. But if you think COVID was rough on us, you haven't seen anything yet. Gen Alpha are the iPad kids. Born between 2010 and 2024, they're known for TikTok and, I'm struggling to think of much else. I have a younger cousin who was born right when this generation was getting started. We call them Generation Alpha because they're the first to be born and raised completely in the 21st century. To them, 9/11 might as well be a fairy tale, as old as World War II or even the Civil War, a significant event in the distant past that shaped the future that they now live in. If Gen Z are empowering, Gen Alpha is inspiring, which is so vague that it's actually depressing. One of the saddest things I've witnessed as a human being is how quickly everyone gave up on Gen Alpha. They're barely even teenagers, and we've already written them off as the doomed generation, perhaps the last generation. We literally call them doomers, and they're very different from anyone that came before. From the perspective of a Gen Z young adult, I might as well be talking to someone from the year 3000. Every year, I hear about Gen Alpha doing something that just feels like a product of rampant misinformation. They're starting to put litter boxes in schools because some of them want to be cats. What? Despite their reputation, I have to stress this. Don't give up on Gen Alpha. It might be up to us to take their hand and be the ones to guide them into adulthood, because they sure aren't getting help from anyone else. Some of you may think I'm being dramatic. Of course Gen Alpha has a support system. It's only because they're so young, they don't have a strong identity yet. You might be right, but when's the last time someone brought up Gen Alpha and didn't have something negative to say about them? I just feel bad, man. Generation Alpha was really affected by COVID. At their oldest, they were only 10 years old when the lockdown began. If Gen Z is going to be known for its depression and isolation, we need to be there for Gen Alpha when they catch up to us. This website puts it best. Quote, "Looking at their context reminds us not just to look back and expect them to be like the generations we've seen in the past, but to recognize that it's a whole new landscape in which they have been born into, and which is shaping them," unquote. I mean, hey, at least they have a cool name, unlike Generation Beta. Who decided this? Okay, now we can really sink our teeth into the drama. Like a dysfunctional family, every generation has a bone to pick with another one. By studying the relationships between these 4 groups, 5? Okay, there's Boomers, Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha. Okay, there's 5. By studying the relationships between these 5 groups, we can predict how future generations will evolve. So let's get started. First up, the main event. The Boomers versus the Millennials. This is a tale as old as time. The generation with all the wealth versus the generation who was promised to receive all of it, eventually ending up with close to none of it. Millennials occupied the hyper-connected world of the early internet, and broadly feel like they shouldn't be criticized by the older generation. Who can't even work an iPhone? Haha, everyone point and laugh. It seems like the millennials hate the boomers because they're holding on to their wealth. It's an unfortunate truth that the millennials are the last generation out of a string of 3 to be promised untold riches of an economic utopia. Suddenly, after 2008, and especially after COVID, those promises were clearly broken. Millennials hate boomers because they felt they were promised something. Similar to Gen Z, the millennials have become very anti-capitalist. Conversely, the boomers hate millennials because from their perspective, as soon as things got tough, they just gave up. They think everything's about themselves. The boomers went out and made something of themselves, damn it. Why is every millennial working from home? They have it much easier than us. They have the internet. Back in my day, we had to walk to school through 3 feet of snow and up a mountain. You guys just don't know how good you have it. Obviously, I'm generalizing here, but this seems to be the main divide between these 2 groups. But in reality, these generations couldn't be any more similar. They both had a youth full of rebellion and social activism. The boomers protested the Vietnam War, just as the millennials are protesting the Gaza conflict. The boomers were promised by their parents that if they work hard, they'll be rewarded with retirement. After 2008, those promises were broken for a lot of those boomers. The 60-something Walmart employee is the symbol of a generation who was stabbed in the back. Millennials witnessed that same broken financial promise, it just happened earlier in their lives. Let's not forget that the boomers are the ones who started this wave of social activism. They pushed for feminism, more diversity in the workplace. The millennials did the same. They just took it a step further, or a step backwards, depending on who you ask. I'm gonna play the devil's advocate here for a second. From the perspective of a boomer, the millennial snobs took their great idea of social activism and mutated it into social justice, fundamentally misunderstanding what it means to fight for a marginalized group. You have to remember, you two are more similar than you realize. You grew up in nearly identical scenarios, having great promise in your younger years, and being betrayed. Everyone's just playing the game, same as everyone else. Millennials, remember the world doesn't revolve around you, and it's not the boomers' fault the world is screwed up. It's the corporation's fault. Everyone got played. Boomers, remember how young and rebellious you once were? You literally had the summer of love. The millennials are trying to do the same. They just don't have the wisdom that you do. Be their guiding figures. You can teach them how to enact real change, and they can teach you their technological skills. We can all help each other. Gen Z, my generation. Listen up. We have a problem on our hands. We're lonely as fuck. I think it's time we all come out of our shelves. Shelves? I think it's time we all come out of our shells and learn to love again. It's up to us to learn from the older generations and be the stewards of the ones after us. It's not going to be easy. We aren't exactly financially secure at the moment. But one thing I do love about our generation is that a lot of us are still holding out hope. We're one of the most resilient generations when it comes to mental health. The fact we've held ourselves together as well as we have is nothing short of impressive. It's a challenging world, but we're not done fighting yet. We have ambition, but we're not burned like the generation before us. Every day, I see more and more of us becoming more accepting of other people, and standing against the people that want to capitalize off us and tear us apart. 100 years ago, there was a generation called the Greatest Generation. They were characterized by the insurmountable odds they faced and their ability to overcome all of them and emerge stronger together. We can be the next greatest generation. We're not going to give up on Gen Alpha, and we're going to help them navigate this world that takes so much. If you've been paying attention, you may have noticed a pattern. Every other generation has a similar identity. The boomers and the millennials are linked, with Gen Alpha ready to join that group. Gen X and the Zoomers are linked. If we want to predict our future, we have to look to the past. If millennials felt cheated out of something, that could be Gen Alpha next. I can see a future where Gen Alpha is upset at the millennials for not stopping the onslaught of technology that only serves to profit off of them and not help them. The generation after them, the betas, would be another sandwich generation, stuck in the middle of a technological revolution. They might look to us, the Gen Zers, for guidance. All of this is theoretical. I think the one thing you should take away from this video is this: don't discount the wisdom of the older generations. We're all stuck in a pattern, and we're all at the whim of whatever tragedy characterizes our generation. World War II, 9/11, the 2008 housing bubble, COVID, the era of generative AI. Every generation has gone through a tragedy and a revolution. Regardless, we're all human, and if we want to put the world back together, we're all going to have to work together. This study of generations was a really eye-opening experience for me. I've always been interested in this so-called generational gap, and I think solving it is one of the keys to a prosperous future. So let me know in the comments. Which generation are you? What do you think of everything I've said here? Was I right on the money, or did I get something wrong? I'd like to know. The more we can come to understand just how similar everybody is, the better we can positively impact the world. So, thank you all for watching. I love you all. Good night.